Les habla Pocho Salcedo y damos la bienvenida a nuestra audiencia en Latinoamérica y de costa a costa aquí en los Estados Unidos continental y en Hawái. Una vez más, explorando con ustedes el ADN de las noticias regionales e internacionales. Intuitivamente, en el diario vivir, decidimos qué organizaciones, empresas y productos merecen nuestra confianza y cuáles no. Muchas veces, corporaciones en las que confiábamos nos decepcionan y también nos sorprendemos viendo organizaciones que, superando grandes catástrofes de confianza, vuelven a ser exitosas. Hoy tenemos una verdadera autoridad en el tema. Exploraremos el poder de la confianza, cómo la adquieren las empresas y cómo la pierden y la ganan nuevamente. Desde Newton, Massachusetts, la profesora de la Escuela de Negocios de Harvard, Sandra Sucher, autora de un libro extraordinario sobre el tema. Professor Sandra Sucher, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Sandra J Sucher is an internationally recognized trust researcher and professor of management practice at Harvard Business School. Sucher studies how organizations build trust and the vital role leaders play in the process. She has authored 110 business cases, technical notes, video interviews, teaching notes, and 3 books. Before joining Harvard, she was a business executive for 20 years, served on corporate and nonprofit boards, and has been chair of the Better Business Bureau, an advisor to the Edelman Trust Barometer and the New Edelman Trust Institute. Her research has been featured in several national publications, and she's also the co-author of a new book, The Power of Trust: How Companies Build It, Lose It, Regain It.
Well, let's get to the core of what trust is in the business world and society in general. Well, that's not an easy task. Trust has become a buzzword, but companies and people's success just about everywhere are anchored on how trust is managed. Please tell us why you decided to investigate and write a book on trust and the corporate world.
I started from a different place. So I actually was studying layoffs. And I spent about 5 years taking a look at what happens to individuals, to the companies, to the communities where there's been an involuntary termination of some kind. And I had a colleague respond to a white paper that I wrote, and he said, I feel like this is part of a bigger something. He said, I don't know what it is, but all I can tell you is I feel like you're onto something, but I think you're part of a small part of a bigger thing. So I was primed to think that there may be more to what I'm doing than not. And in January of 2017, I took a research trip to Japan to study an amazing company called Recruit Holdings. It's a tech company, about $20 billion in sales. And this company had recovered from a trust scandal in the 1980s that was so great that the Prime Minister of Japan and his entire cabinet had to resign. So I show up, years later, they're $20 billion in sales. They've got 50,000 employees around the globe. And this presented me with the question of how can you recover from something like that? How is it possible that they are now still up and standing? And what is it that they did? And so in working with my co-author, Shaleen Gupta, we started backing into, okay, what's going on here? And then we realized that my layoff research really was a part of this bigger question. And so that was how it started. It was kind of a wake-up call from a colleague, and then a research trip that just sort of said, okay, there's something going on here that I for sure don't understand.
There's a quote in your book, "He who does not trust enough will not be trusted," attributed to Lao Tzu. You start the reader with a very personal story of trust, and you relate how your co-author, Shaleen Gupta, asked you to reconsider the focus of your work. Tell us about it.
So Shalene and I are in a lobby in this hotel in Tokyo. And I still remember because the cushions were sort of slippery silk and my back kept slipping and they kept falling out from behind me and I'm getting irritated. And we're wrapping up a discussion about this company called Recruit and how we're going to write a case about it. And Shalene leaned in and she said to me, because we were talking about the direction of, how this fit in my layoff book, which I'd already pretty much drafted. And she just said, "Are you sure you really want to write a book about layoffs?" So this was one of these moments. I don't know, how many people in the audience have had someone have the courage to actually ask a kind of a question like that. And quite honestly, Shalene was, as she's proved to be a marvelous co-author and colleague and collaborator, she was spot on. Literally, as soon as she said, I said, "Oh, phew, I don't have to write this layoffs book. I really can go after something bigger." And so we spent the next couple of hours thinking about what would that be. I think it's in this area of trust. How can they do what they did? But the moment that we reflect on in the book is, what was it like? What prompted her to ask that question? How much risk was she at? Because, trust, we don't understand it, but this moment shows it perfectly. Trust is when we are vulnerable to another person's actions and intentions. So the question is, how vulnerable was Shalene at that moment? She was unbelievably vulnerable. We'd only worked together for 6 months. I could have just said, "Are you kidding me? Who are you to ask me this question?" And so she was taking a big risk. And I, on the other hand, ended up responding as positively as I did because I had come to trust her. She struck me as a straight up kind of person who really did have my best interest at heart. And I thought, my gosh, someone who's willing to ask that kind of a question is a really good person, because they're really willing to put themselves out there like that. And so it was this moment of vulnerability on both sides. Where she asked the question, I have to think about it, respond to her, and it became a sort of a plowing the field moment for us, where we came back to that many times and sort of said, okay, I think that's when trust is happening, when you have those kind of moments, and it really anchored the research in something that was quite personal, and it helped it from being too abstract, right, and too kind of up in the air.
Well, it seems like understanding trust on a personal level is essential, but in your words, it becomes more complex when we interact with companies. You divide the elements of trust into 4 different categories: competence, motives, means, and impact. Let us talk about competence. What is competence in itself enough to earn trust?
So competence is the foundation of trust. I mean, step back and think about it. Why would you trust any organization that couldn't do the thing it committed that it was going to be able to do? And so competence, without question, is the place that we start. There's actually 2 kinds of competence, at least in my view. One of is kind of a technical competence, nuts and bolts, can I do this thing? And there's true managerial competence, which is sort of like reading the room, right? And being able to understand the views of other people. And so competence is the starting point. And the example that, Shalene and I both like to use is Uber. So if competence were all that mattered with respect to trust, we would say, okay, I'm going to pop into that Uber, no second thoughts. But in fact, for years, many people have had many second thoughts about whether or not they go into that Uber. And they do that for good reason. And those are these 3 other elements that we talk about in the book. And the first of those is motives. So in the same way that I was talking with Shalene and I kind of cared about, did she have my best interest at heart in asking that question, we think that way about corporations. Right. And so there's this horrifying story about Uber in 2013, where a driver ran into a family of 4 in San Francisco. They killed a little 6-year-old girl, injured the mother and her brother, and the family, of course, sued. And in court, Uber argued that the driver was not an Uber employee because he didn't have a passenger in his car and he hadn't yet accepted his next ride. So this is a great example of motives where Uber only cares about what's good for Uber. Uber's not thinking about the harm that they've done. They're not protecting their employee. They're cutting him loose into the process, and they're certainly not caring about their customers. So we judge motives based on the priorities that we see people set and whose interest they take into account. So that's the second domain. And then the third area is kind of fair means. So for example, Shalene, she didn't ask that question of me in a public meeting. She didn't put me on the spot. And she was thoughtful about, let's just do this. We're here in this lobby, no witnesses, right? No microphones. And so that's sort of fair means. With Uber, there was a year between 2013 and 2015, there are about 12 months where Uber asked its employees, its drivers, to book and then cancel 5,000 rides with Lyft, its number one competitor. Now, the name of the game in this business is showing up on time. And so if someone is disrupting your operation like that, that's unfair, right? And so that's when we talk about fair means, we're saying don't be like Uber, right? That's what it looks like to violate that. And then the last part of the model is its impact. It's like, so what we care about is you can tell me anything you want about what you think you're doing. I'm going to judge you based on the impact of your actions. And there is a marvelous, awful story. In 2017, a woman named Susan Fowler, who is a reliability engineer at Uber at the time, posted a whistleblowing blog post. And it was about what it's like to work as a woman at Uber, which had a famously sexist culture. And the impact of that culture is that when she started, women were 25% of her division of engineers. And when she left, they were 6%. Now, Uber didn't intend to have all those women leave. So intentions here don't matter. What matters is the actual impact of the culture that they created. And so the end of the Uber story is, I believe, I'm not a very religious people, but in this sense, I do believe in God, is that Uber has lost market share to Lyft, right? People care about whether or not they're dealing with someone who's fair. And so Uber started with over 90% of the ride-hailing market in the US. It's now down to about 68%. And so what they did is they opened up this advantage for Lyft to come in and say, guess what? I'm the non-Uber ride-hailing option. And the courts in the UK have started to say that stance that you have that those people aren't your employees. Nah, they really are your employees. And so some of the nature of their business model is going to have to be tweaked. But so that's how the model works. It starts with this foundation of competence. And then there are these other issues in the moral domain. There's the question of people's motives, the means that they use, and then just the on-the-ground impact of the actions and what effect they have on people.
Tomamos una pequeña pausa y retornamos muy pronto. Aprovechamos esta oportunidad para saludar a 3 de nuestras estaciones en Estados Unidos. DATV en Dayton, Ohio, Crea TV en San José, California, y BronxNet TV y su red de canales en la ciudad de Nueva York. Gracias por tenernos en su programación. Y volvemos a Newton, Massachusetts, para continuar nuestra conversación con la profesora Sandra Sucher de la Escuela de Negocios de Harvard. Well, the book focuses on fairness as elemental in any relationship, but it is often botched by corporations internally dealing with their employees and externally with the public.
There's a great example of how fairness works in both of those areas, and it involves the company Nokia. So we know Nokia, mobile phone manufacturer, now 5G, so Nokia, I'm going to start with how it is that we botch it, right? So you said how we botch it, and then how do we get it back? So the botching part looks sort of like this. In 2008, Nokia decides that it's going to close a plant that it has in Bochum, Germany. And they have very good business reasons to do this. So it turns out that Bochum represents 6% of their global production footprint and 23% of their employee costs. So any business person is going to say, okay, that's kind of a no-brainer, costs too much money for us to do our business there. However, they completely botch coming in and doing this. They make an announcement. They sort of say, we're closing down. They have no preparation on the ground with anybody in the community, any of the union representatives, any of the people who would care about the fact that this plant is going to be closed. And people erupt. 15,000 people take to the streets. People start sending their mobile phones back to Nokia. They have these bins out there. And so people, you put your phone in here, we'll send it back to Nokia. The government gets involved. What about all that money that we gave you to do business here in Germany? And Nokia ends up needing to pay 80,000 euros per employee to close the plant, which was probably, at the time, it was certainly the biggest expense for plant closure in Germany and probably anywhere in the world, honestly, at that point. And they did a kind of a back of the envelope exercise afterwards. And they said, well, if they had simply not done that, if they had been in France, neighboring country, roughly similar market, they would have made 800 million euros more in sales and about another $100 million more in profit. That's how much they lost by the disruption, the 6 months that it took for this process to unfold. So now to the recovery. If you fast forward to 2010, late 2010, 2011, Nokia is in the process of being outcompeted in the phone market. Right, smartphones have come in, Apple, Android. They have nothing really comparable to compete with that. Their low end is being outcompeted by phones from India and China. And so they are losing money. For the first time in 18 years, they're going to post a loss. So Jorma Ollila, who's the chairman, knows they're going to have a pretty major restructuring. And his watchword here was not another Bochum. Right. So they said, whatever it is that they're going to do, they're going to try very hard not to have everyone hate them as they go through this process. So he appoints a guy, Esko Aho, who had been the prime minister of Finland, the youngest prime minister of Finland, to be in charge of figuring out what they would do. And they come up with a new approach to layoffs. And they call this the bridge program. And the scale of this is really important. It's a question of competence, really. So it affects 18,000 people in 13 countries around the world. So this is not like closing a 2,000 person factory in Bochum, Germany. This is everywhere. And what they decide is they're going to take a bet on trust. And the model that they have in their mind is if we can guarantee for employees, we will help them find another job, that employees will stay with them for the 2 years that the restructuring is going to take. So very few companies are willing to make that bet. They even asked their board for approval to take this approach because they knew that they were going to shift the priorities of the company from focusing on the shareholder and all of that to really prioritizing the needs of these employees. Board was all for it. No one wanted another Bochum, and they thought it was the right thing to do. So they end up with a program that has 5 paths to getting a new job. They help you get a new job at Nokia. They help you get a new job outside of Nokia. They give you money to start a new business. They pay for education if that's what you'd like to do. And if you can think of something they hadn't thought of, they'll give you money for that as well. Just make a good case for it. And so because there's choice, which is a big part of fairness, right? I'm not determining for you what's your path. People like this very much. They love the transparency. And they told people up to 2 years in advance, you're going to be losing your job. So everyone knew the deal. And everyone said, okay, but we trust that you're going to do these things to help us actually get another job. And the results that they had are just spellbinding. So 60% of 18,000 people across 13 countries knew their next step the day they left the firm.
Oh, that's amazing.
Right. And so this is the kind of thing. And, they had the same percent of revenues from new products which was about a third of their revenues come from new products during their restructuring. And the whole thing cost only 4% of their restructuring charges. This was managed by employees and managers who themselves are going to be losing their jobs. And everyone was very committed to making sure that this program works. So, anyone who says to you, lost trust cannot be regained, that's not true. And it was one of the first myths about trust that we understood because we had this example of Recruit in Japan. It's like, okay, if the prime minister resigns and you come out the other side of this, there's clearly a way to get, but it's hard work. And it requires all of the skills that I've been talking about in order to pull it off, but it definitely is achievable.
Yes, indeed. Many companies mismanage trust, lose it, but to recover it seems to be a concerted effort for a long time.
Yeah, this is not sort of, I announce to people, I love you now. And you say, oh, good, I feel so much better, and we all kind of march off the sunset. No, this is actual actions on the ground that people can see, participate in, and understand how they benefit from. And if you do that, then people are going to actually play ball and they're going to say, okay, I get it. They really meant what they said and they were doing what they said.
So what is the role of leadership in generating trust in their organizations, even at the government at large? Perhaps a global example of this could be the breach on the US Capitol in early 2020, isn't it?
So the breach of the US Capitol was spellbinding in a horrible way. This was a moment where everyone, certainly in the United States and elsewhere, was watching an attack on the nature of government. And the role of government at that point is to be competent. And what we saw is that the Capitol Police were not prepared. Actually, they'd been getting warnings about the fact something was going to happen in December, and they ignored those warnings. And so one of the big questions, the first questions was just a question of competence. And did people understand what they were going to be dealing with? They were ill-equipped in terms of the equipment that they had. And they underestimated the threat of violence from the people here, probably for, quite candidly, kind of racist reasons, going, this is a white crowd. And, they're not going to attack us. How bad can they be? Right, sorry. So I'm sort of showing a bias on my part when I say that. And after that, then you sort of say, well, what is it that the company, the government officials could be doing? Well, they could say, this is a terrible thing. But in fact, half the government doesn't say that, right? Half the government says, you know what, we understand why they're doing what they're doing. President Trump at the time says, these are people who just are so angry about what happened. Of course, they're going to erupt like this. Now, you want to know what leadership isn't, right? That's taking the power that comes with leadership, converting it to a personal justice cause, which is how it is that you think about who benefits and why. And so there was definitely this question about the motives of the people, what they were saying at the time. And the other problem that there was is that no one sort of stood up and said, we take responsibility for the fact that we incited this. Right? People do not lead insurrections on their own. Some people do, some people are quite disaffected against their governments. But this was aided and abetted by very concrete examples of support for years from various politicians. And so, I think that part of why this was such a bellwether incident in the United States was that it really laid bare exactly the consequences of what it means when leadership doesn't step up and do the things that they need to do in order to have a system where you should have trust. And so that was why we ended up doing an article about it, because we said, oh my gosh, this is what we've been studying really large, right? And so that's our take on that.
Deciding to trust a company or not is part of our daily interaction with corporations, but it is particularly difficult now that technology plays such a significant role. What do you think about that?
So technology is, the proverbial black box. So we interact with these systems. We do not have visibility to what's in them. So if trust is vulnerability to other organizations' actions and intentions, we are hugely vulnerable in the world of technology. And so I think the pushback that you're seeing against the big tech companies comes out of that. People saying, okay, we get it that we're vulnerable. We get it that you have power. You have abused this power, right? And so, I was thinking about this question because you were kind enough to share it in advance. And I think that one of the things I would look for is a tech company that has a sustainable business model. So many of these business models are based on exploitation, either from a competitive standpoint or from the workers inside the organization, like Amazon. And so, as a business person, I don't think that's sustainable. Right. And so that's a part where I think we should say what's going on here. A second part has to do with the judgments that are made in the algorithms that are used by these tech companies. And there's lots of research to suggest that some of these algorithms, because humans create them, actually are intensely biased and privilege some people and really downgrade others. And so I think that's an area to be worried about. And lest you think that this is impossible, I just, I keep thinking about, well, why is Salesforce so big, $20 billion? It continues to have an ad that runs on the first page of the Wall Street Journal every single day that shows the market share that they have, which is like an invitation for an antitrust action, right? And no one goes after them, right? And so Mark Benioff runs a different kind of company. It's a tech company, they have black box like anybody else. So it's not inherent in the nature of technology that it works like this. Recruit Holdings is actually a technology company. So no one should tell you this is inevitable or this is what it's like in technology, because that's simply not true.
Well, Sandra, it was such a pleasure to have you back in the show, a real honor. And this is a very, very interesting book and as usual, a challenging and thought-provoking conversation. We hope to have you back soon. Thank you very much again.
Thank you so much.
Las empresas que no adoptan la confianza en el núcleo de su comportamiento están destinadas a perecer o tener un éxito limitado. La confianza no solo determina la velocidad de la transacción comercial, sino también la calidad de las relaciones. La confianza no es una palabra de moda que usamos para comercializar productos y servicios. Es el estándar más alto e indispensable en corporaciones exitosas y otras organizaciones. Hasta una próxima oportunidad, cuando juntos exploremos una vez más el ADN de las noticias. Gracias por el privilegio de su compañía.